It is 2:30, so we are going to get started right on the dot. Good afternoon, and thank you for being with us today for our third panel in a series of Facebook Live panels on coping during COVID-19. All panels are recorded and available on Seattle Children's YouTube channel, and the next panel will be held on Friday, May 15th at 2:30 p.m. Just a note that we're not discussing COVID-19 from a medical perspective. If you're looking for that information, please visit the COVID-19 advisory page on seattlechildrens.org. Today, we're talking about school in the time of COVID. We're going to talk about the school-to-home partnership, educational rights, especially for those receiving special education, and strategies for at-home learning. The panel will discuss information and strategies for about 40 minutes and then save 20 minutes for Q&A, so please feel free to submit your questions at any time. I'm going to get us started here with some introductions, but this event will remain on Seattle Children's Facebook page, and a recording of this panel is available in the coming days. We are updating seattlechildrens.org/coping and COVID with resources and information. My name is Kashi Arora, and I'm the moderator today. I'm a mental and behavioral health project manager here in community health and benefit at Seattle Children's. I'm going to introduce our panelists and have them wave since they are all remote and virtual. We are joined today by a couple familiar faces. Scott Hampton is the manager of Seattle Children's K-12 Educational Services. Jim Mancini is the speech and language pathologist and the director of parent education and outreach with the Seattle Children's Autism Center. We are thrilled today to be joined by two guest panelists. Scott Robb is a special education parent and community liaison with the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, or OSPI. Stacy Dim is the executive director of the Arc of Washington, a nonprofit champion for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Thank you all for being with us today. This has been a challenging and unusual time for families and students, which seems like an understatement. So let's start by talking about what we're hearing from our community right now, and then we want to get right to practical, concrete things we can do to support our children's education. So Jim, I'd like to go to you first to talk about what are some of the things you've heard that parents and families are experiencing.
Great. Thanks, Kashi, and thanks everybody for joining us this Friday afternoon after probably many Zoom calls if you are, like the rest of us. So thanks for being here. And one thing that we've really heard, or the biggest thing we've really heard, is this is really hard. It's really hard for parents, whether you have young children or old children. It's hard for the students, certainly, and it's really hard for the teachers as we all try to adjust to this new normal. And we're all out of our routine, and there's a heck of a lot of uncertainty about what's happening in the future, right? And I think it's hard for a lot of different reasons for a lot of different people. One thing that we're all probably experiencing is a lot of stress, right? Parents trying to work from home and educate their kids at the same time. Parents who are out of work right now, and the stresses that are related to that. Certainly the students, I have a senior in high school right now who, is having a really hard time, kind of thinking about the future and thinking about what next year will bring. And teachers, and I know Scott's going to talk more about teachers, but teachers are out there doing the best they can with the situation that we have. And I think it goes without saying that just the stress of COVID-19, right? We worry about people getting sick. We worry about our family getting sick. We worry about people who we know are sick, right? There are families who are experiencing loss right now, significant loss. And, personally, last weekend, my daughter had a fever and everything changed for us. All of a sudden, we need to shift everything. And, luckily the test came back negative. But it was amazing how quickly we went to, all right, well, here we go with this. Okay. There's a lot of variability, and I think that's what a lot of parents have expressed. There's so much variability from what they're getting from the schools, right? We hear some kids who are on video conference calls during the day. We have situations where they're receiving packets through email. Sometimes it's an email that is sent out once that says, hey, let us know if you need some help. And some parents haven't heard from schools at all, right? So there's a ton of variability. And of my two high schoolers, I've got two different high schools. One is online a lot, and the other one is not online at all, right? And that's just, within the Seattle School District, within, two high schools, those are the things that we're hearing. And I think this really shines a light on the disparities that are, present in our community. We have some families who have no access to technology. We have families who, 4 kids need to share one device, right? We were joking about our own challenges with tech issues, and we've got families, parents who are like struggling to get their kids to the table. They sit at the table, and then the tech crashes, right? Kids have a tantrum, parents have a tantrum. I think we can all kind of relate to some of that. Okay. And then finally, I know Scott's going to talk more about the teachers, but I have to be able to call out some of the amazing innovations that teachers have been able to do. And my final comment here, and my wife is a first grade teacher, and it's a quote from her. And, this is after a Zoom class with her first graders. And she says, "I hate this. I miss them so much I could cry."
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Kashi. I think Jim, that nails it. I lead this incredible group of 9 educators at Seattle Children's, and each one of them is hearing from communities and schools throughout our region. They love their students. They miss them. They're aware of these really big challenges and disparities, and they want to find a way to overcome them. And right now, it's really hard. They're finding it very hard. Their own experience of access to technology and childcare and training to do this in a new way is variable. And the developmental levels of their students really impacts the way that they're able to deliver these services through a remote continuous learning. And what we have grown in such deep appreciation for is that they long to make a meaningful and purposeful difference, even now, even in these last 6 weeks of the school year, even as we try and chart a way through this difficult time. And like Jim said, we're seeing a lot of successes. We know that the experience of students and families and teachers is variable. And we also are seeing increasing levels of success in connection. Some of my own teachers, Jim, connected to your wife's comment, some of my own teachers, I can remember when the first week we went to online connection and continuous learning, that we didn't have the opportunity to connect this way with very many patients. And the first time we did, there was this, like, our shoulders dropped, like, this is what we're here for. We're here for these kids. We love these kids. And that's what every teacher in the community is feeling right now.
Thank you both. I mean, this is a huge variability in experience, and we have talked a lot about how much different information families are getting too. And so we are very fortunate today to be joined by Scott Robb with the Washington OSPI. Tim, let's start with you to get some clarity on current state and expectations and where families can go for reliable information. Scott R., what would you share with families?
Thank you, Kashi. And I wanted to say also, it's just a brief moment to say thank you to the team at Seattle Children's, because Jim and Scott invited me to be a part of this panel, and also to be here with Stacy, because I think this opportunity doesn't come along, I think, very often for me to be a part of this, to try to reach out to families, kind of doing it on a one-on-one basis. And now I'm glad to be talking with all of you and to have this opportunity. So thank you first for that. Right. I mean, the current state of the system is not something we recognize anymore. I mean, general education and special education, it doesn't exist as we've known it anymore because of this crisis. I'm going to echo a lot of what Jim has already said and what Scott has already said, because I'm hearing that too from educators, practitioners, from families, families even within the same household having completely different experiences. And that's frustrating. And it's every day there's always kind of a new angle to this that we're trying to figure out at the state level of how can we respond to support all the different stakeholders we have in our educational system. And one of the big themes to sort of take away, I think, where things stand is this idea that you've heard all of us talk about already, is continuous learning. That's what the state superintendent, Chris Reykdal, has laid down as the expectation, that he expects learning to take place, that each district should have a plan for implementing some form of continuous learning for each student. The goal is to keep going forward and to not go backwards, not to let this crisis completely paralyze us, and that we have to go forward. We don't have another choice. So to create opportunities for all students to engage in learning in some way, and that's very unique for the students who are eligible for special education. I'm glad we get to talk about that. And one of the resources I would point out is the OSPI website in particular. If you want to stay up to date on what the superintendent is saying, you can go to that website, the bulletins, there's a whole lot of information. I'll make a plug in particular for the YouTube videos that the superintendent has been putting out. I've found that they're very helpful, and the last two in particular. There was one specifically addressing students who are eligible for special education and the services they receive, as well as the sort of values that the superintendent is putting forth to give guidelines for school districts moving forward. The superintendent does a good job of explaining OSPI's role in all of this, the authority we do have and the authority that we don't have. So I think that's where families can get reliable information. I think that that's where they can get a sense of what's going on in the system as a whole, because special education doesn't exist separately from general education. I think it was really important. I'm glad that we can take a moment to start talking about that too, that special education exists to teach students the skills necessary and to give them the supports they need in order to access the general curriculum. And right now, access is the biggest issue. I mean, there's inequities all over the place with how we've set up this continuous learning, and we're trying to adapt to that constantly. But if you're going to go for the most reliable sources of information, where the state sort of stands on this and where the guidance is for special ed as well as in general ed, I would keep an eye on the OSPI website for that information.
Thank you. And in talking both about general education and special education, we're going to spend a little bit of time on general education right now, and then spend a good chunk of time on special education and how to adapt our current situations to set ourselves up for success in that space. Scott Hampton, can we go to you to talk a little bit about general education?
Yeah, I think what's important with general education, a few things that I'm thinking about. One is that the parent voice is extremely important here. So as it is all throughout our educational system, feedback to teachers is just extremely critical to the success of all of this. All of our teachers all throughout the country, certainly in our region, are attempting to invent a great method for delivering instruction and maintaining skills within our student population. And so as we look to districts for how they're going to do that, districts then are saying, okay, here's the framework that we're thinking about. And we as families then have the opportunity to speak into that and say, within the context of the emotional needs of my family, within the context of our family values, within the context of what we're able to do right now, here's how we are stepping towards you. So some examples of that are, within my own household, I have two school-age daughters and a preschooler, and with my school-age daughters, we are giving feedback back and forth to our teachers of like, oh, that worked really well. The way that you set up that call or the instructions that you gave on that assignment were very clear. We're also giving feedback of saying we're not able to commit to being on that call. For this next assignment it's too much. We're noticing that in our house we really need to focus on our family relationships right now, or providing kind of some social emotional coaching to our kids in ways that can help them feel stable, firm, comforted during this really complicated time. So within general education, I would say that communication back and forth with your team is really, really important. I think it's really important maybe for families if you are modifying the amount of work down. So a teacher asks your student to do a certain amount of work, and you say, hey, our family's not going to be able to do that much. what would you prioritize? It's important to communicate that to your kids, why that is, and helping them feel comfortable and okay with not doing all of the work that the teacher has assigned. Because we know that students often really want to rise to the level of expectation that their teachers set. So if you as a family are modifying that, it's important to have a dialogue with your student about why it's okay to not do all of the work during this time. And finally, um, well, I think that communication is critical, and what it does is it allows you to be aligned with your school team on what the plan is going forward, what they're asking, and what you're able to do. If you can align yourselves that way, we can really start to alleviate some of the stress of the system.
Thank you. That communication and that been a huge topic of conversation as we've prepared for today. Before we go to Stacy and Jim, Scott, Rob, I wanted to come back to you just for a minute or two and say, is there anything you might want families to know about special education right now specifically, and sort of the rights or what to expect about that before we talk about what parents can do in terms of strategies?
Right. Similar to the general ed system, I mean, right now, it's very clear that special ed is not going to look the same way that it's always looked prior to the school buildings being closed. The IEP, it's going to be impossible perhaps to deliver it exactly how it's written. So that's the expectation is not to follow the IEP the way it's exactly written. The expectation, though, is to, as Scott already mentioned, the communication. There needs to be some two-way communication going on between families and school districts. And as the superintendent laid out already, the expectation is for continuous learning, and parents are a part of that conversation. There needs to be sort of the two-way back and forth communication about what families can do, what they can handle, and what else we need. And the school districts need to be able to listen and be responsive to that. And so, right. I mean, special ed rights, there has not been any waiver of any kind of special education rights. So students who are in special education, they still have the expectation of receiving a free, appropriate public education. It's going to look very different in terms of what are the provision of services to experience or have what free, appropriate public education looks like. OSPI is unable to sort of dictate, and that would actually go against kind of the purposes of special ed, what those services should look like. They might be virtual, they may be over the telephone, there may be some sort of distance or remote sort of contact that's going on. So, I mean, we can't mandate a particular way for special ed to happen at this point. And this is where it becomes really important for families to be able to communicate what their needs are to the districts. But at a basic level, I mean, the rights have not been waived. Special ed still needs to function as best that it can. We need to do the best that it can. We have a great deal of innovation in special ed, sort of organically already. And so we've got educators who are putting their innovation sort of skills to the test here. And I hear stories of some great success as well. Also, though, there is struggle with the communication. There are some families who say they have not heard anything from their school district, or very minimal or very ineffective points of communication. And this is opportunities where we need to start talking about what can families do if perhaps they are not getting communication from their school district, because that on a basic level, we should expect some communication about what the continuous learning is going to look like, and how special ed is going to what it's going to look like, what can be done during this time. So that's I would say that's kind of where it stands, and I think we can go into more depth about kind of strategies for families if they're not getting what they need.
I think that's the perfect segue, that we'd like to talk next about what families can do and strategies that they can take. And I said this at the top, but we are very fortunate today to have Stacy Dim from the ARC of Washington. And the ARC is a nonprofit champion for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. So Stacy, we'd like to start with you first. What do families need to know about special education and strategies they can take?
Thanks again for having me on this panel too. I appreciate my colleagues here. As everybody has mentioned, this is just an experience that none of us has ever had, nor did we ever think we would. So all of us are contemplating, how do we cope? What can we expect? And what are schools doing to address the needs of students with disabilities during this just really unprecedented time? I think, as Scott mentioned, it's important to remind people that special education has not been waived. It's not optional. Um, but yet we know that things have not really come together as quickly as maybe some families would like and that they need. Um, some good things have happened. This switch to tech is just absolutely revolutionary. In some cases, it's removing barriers for students who have traditionally or historically had barriers, and tech can remove some of those things. Captioning, screen readers, visual meetings, physical barriers within school, less stimulation, more one-on-one attention, smaller groups, instruction in smaller bits. Some of those things might be enduring, and some families are reporting that those are really successful. Teachers are opening up their kitchen tables and their living rooms through Zoom. There's a much more personal sort of connection now to teachers that some students are really enjoying. Teachers are offering up their cell phones sometimes for texting, just to help a student with a question or who has an anxiety. And more conversations are personal. Obviously, when you're in your home, you're more likely to have a relaxed approach with the students that you're teaching. So this kind of forced collaboration with families can turn out to be a real partnership, and we're hearing that from some people. On the other hand, it's kind of created an exacerbation of the separation of services too. So there's not as much connection to what's generally happening, to the social milieu that generally exists within the classroom. And most learning takes place in a social context. We know that, or we'd be doing Zoom all the time. And all of us know this is not as highly effective as being together. So these inequities can really be exacerbated when families don't have access to technology, they don't have bandwidth or assistive technology for their child, a computer, enough smartphones. If you speak a language other than English, these are all real challenges. In addition to the lack of therapies, routines, environments, and access to peers. So I think it's important for us to kind of focus on, as a family, when you're trying to put this together, what do you really need? And what does your child really need? I think, if anything, this crisis has forced all of us to think about what are our priorities. And in delivering special education, that's not going to be any different. So look at what you need in the environment that you're in, which is your home generally. What does your child need for support? How does the IEP support some of those priorities that you've come up with? And really focus on what you can do, and be able to express to other people what you need. I would say this to families, even if we weren't in this situation: pull out your advocacy skills. You've got to really connect. You've got to be determined in connecting with your child's teacher. If you can't find them, call the school, call the district. Really isolate that primary person who's going to support you through this, if that has not happened already. And we know in some cases it really hasn't happened. So connect with other parents as much as you can. You've got to get that emotional support from other people who are going through the same thing that you are. And we know that alone reduces so much anxiety. And then I think just being head of a nonprofit in this time is unprecedented. Nonprofits have really stepped up to fill in some of the gaps. So if you're not getting everything you need through the school and through the school program, just know that there's some real innovations that are out there now. For example, the Healthcare Authority has really opened up access to telehealth. So if you have private insurance or you have Medicaid, any insurance that would generally give you access to things like speech therapy, physical therapy, occupational therapy, ABA, or other behavioral support therapy, you should be contacting your insurance company and say, can I get an evaluation? If I had it before, can I expand my services? If I didn't have it before, can I get it now? and really look into how you could supplement some of what's happening that way. In addition, most nonprofits that offered support services to parents before, they're really offering those virtually now. So most of the ARCs have parent support groups. They have groups that are targeted toward different cultural and linguistic groups. So, for example, there are virtual coffee and conversation groups at your local ARC. There's a Silver Tsunami group that meets. Parent support group just talk about emotional support. There's a parent-to-parent program in nearly every county now, so everyone should be contacting their parent-to-parent program and trying to find parent matches, parent mentors, other people to chat with about what you're experiencing. And then ultimately, when you need some real support, there's an education ombuds office that you can contact for help. They've got a web page developed very specifically for COVID and COVID support. PAVE has put out some amazing materials in the last short while around how to navigate these changes. So I think, again, just think outside a little bigger than just your school program and look at what your immediate community can offer. And if you don't know, call an ARC, call an ombuds, call a PAVE, and track those down.
Thank you. Jim, what would you add to that? I know we've had lots of conversations about how valuable the needs assessment and then the prioritization is, and thinking about how to supplement what your child is getting. And I think you have had some thoughts as well on what families can be doing right now to support.
Yep, thank you. And as a speech language pathologist, like I said last time, the key here is communication and effective communication, right? One thing that I heard after talking to a lot of parents is just being very proactive, whether it was a proactive move from the parent to ask the teacher and say, hey, I know we're going to need this help. Can you write us this social story? Can you help us create a schedule for home, right? Proactive, movement by the teachers to say, all right, well, here's, this right at the beginning when we thought, all right, well, maybe this is just 2 weeks. We heard these great stories of teachers that were like, all right, well, I'm in it, I'm on it. I'm going to, be very proactive about how I'm communicating with my students and the parents. Less effective is a very reactive stance when you just have to wait. And, if we're waiting, then, half the parents aren't going to call, right? And if you're, we heard that story of, the email saying, all right, well, if you need some help, just let us know. Parents might not know what to ask for, right? So, how can you then say, what I would suggest to the parents is to write back and say, well, what are some things that you can provide for me, right? Teachers that are out there, think of a list. All right, these are things that are working with other families right now. So in that needs assessment that Kashi referred to is going back to what I think everyone has talked about is like, how do we prioritize what is the most important thing right now? What is going to be the most helpful for you in this situation at this time, right? So you take that needs assessment, trying to figure out, all right, well, what is getting in the way of my child within in his or her continuous learning, right? I know a family who that just getting the child is hitting a lot of non-compliance, refusals to do everything, contacting the school and saying, all right, well, here's our biggest problem right now. The fact that he's refusing to do everything that we ask him to do, right? That's going to be different than, kind of the needs assessment and recognizing, well, what's the point of school right now anyway, and Scott referred to kind of identifying what your family values are, recognizing what can we learn from this situation. I know a family who, they've got more significant needs. They are having, daily Zoom calls, and, the child loves it just for the purpose of socialization, right? Are they really going to be picking up on a lot of, is it going to be an effective educational tool for, other things? Maybe not. Right. But if you say, all right, well, we're going to work on, and this is an opportunity for socialization, and that child really, can gain something from that, then that's a good thing to focus on. Okay. I love I've always loved the IEP, the individual education plan, and it's never more true than right now is that individualized aspect of that I in the IEP, right? So thinking about that, what, your teachers and parents, how do we work together? How do we establish a partnership that allows that relationship to move forward and to identify what can we do to provide that support in this moment. Okay. And like Stacy said, I think that we are hearing some great things. The silver lining of COVID-19 is that, maybe we're learning how our children learn a little bit. Maybe we're more aware of the things that are hard for them in their learning, right? You've got kids who have significant sensory issues or difficulty processing information or high degrees of distractibility. And I'm hearing from parents that my kid's doing better right now in some areas, right? How do we take that information? How do we use this as an opportunity to say, all right, well, I'm learning something that I can move, that once things return back to some semblance of normal, I can use those things that we're learning about how my child learns most effectively. And let's start putting those into practice, in the new IEP or the new plans. And I think one family kind of, let me know that, let's have a plan for this uncertainty in the future, right? We've got 6 more weeks here, of what we think of as this school year. We don't know what's going to happen in the fall, right? And I think that it's absolutely a valid thing to talk to your teachers, talk to your school, and say, what's your contingency plan for the different possibilities for the future, right? A lot of this happened and we weren't prepared for it, right? We should be prepared for it in the fall. And I think that it's definitely worthwhile to ask, to say, what is your plan? I think, hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst is absolutely a good way to be thinking about this right now. And the last thing I'll say is, documentation, right? Thinking about and just making sure that you are documenting, right? And this was our recommendation way before COVID-19. Is just make sure that you're documenting the challenges that your child is experiencing. If you feel like they're losing skills in some area, right? There will be opportunities later on to have that conversation, to discuss that. Maybe there's going to be new IEP goals. Maybe we need to have a new evaluation, as a result of this. It's still a lot of unknowns, but if you document now, and get your medical providers involved in this documentation, just to kind of say, all right, well, we're establishing, hey, this is what's happened, so that when we are sitting down at a table again, hopefully sooner than later, we're going to be able to talk about this, and we've got some documentation that this has happened.
Kashi, I'd love to jump in and just say, Jim, I really appreciate that thought about documentation, because what that allows is for great collaboration now, as you're able to demonstrate what's happening for your child, and it aids collaboration down the road when we say, okay, we're having a resumption of some versions of learning that we're more familiar with, and look here, I've kind of kept track. How can now we together partner to make up for lost time? And if we think about that within special education and general education, everyone is worried about their child. We care about the well-being and progress of our children. We want them to advance at the same pace, or oftentimes at greater paces than their peers. That's what we hope for our children. And what I want to say is that we as a panel have talked a lot about that there's a high degree of variability right now in the education system. We know that. And as a state and as a country, we've adopted, you've heard our superintendent, and we've talked about this quite a bit on our panel. We've heard about this idea of do no harm. what we want as an education system right now is to encourage growth and progress within kids, and not penalize them for the ways that that growth is stunted due to barriers, and due to this change. And as Stacy said, we are expecting fundamental shifts in the way that we model our education system coming out of this. So while this is now a grand experiment in process, we are anticipating good, positive, fundamental shifts. And so that documentation, that feedback to your school can really help as we approach those shifts. Yeah, so I guess I just wanted to jump in and add that because I loved hearing what you all were saying.
Thank you.
Right. I'd like to jump in also briefly I think this is a good moment to make kind of the shameless plug for the OSPI website, but specifically to special education. The special education section at OSPI has a page dedicated specifically to answering special education questions and providing resources as best we can, to help figure out what does this all look like, for families and for practitioners. But families in particular, I think, could benefit from checking it out. There is a model or a template that's used for continuous learning that families can look at and use on their own. If you're looking for how do I even start documenting the way Jim was talking about, or how do we even start creating priorities the way that Stacy was talking about, and then you can rely upon community-based resources like PAVE and the ARC and all of them around our state to help formulate what are your priorities and needs at this point, and how can I share that back with my school district. I've heard many school districts using the OSPI form as basically the starting point for creating their own, because this is not a form that's required, that anyone's required to use, but it's merely a tool to really start thinking about how are we going to do this right now. What can we communicate back and forth with each other around um, the IEP in terms of what are the goals that we really need to work on, what are we seeing, what's happening as a result of these closures. Some of the examples that everyone's already mentioned, and like Scott just said, what do we need to do to keep the learning going forward and try not to do any more harm than we've already experienced from these closures, because there are some great successes out there and families may be seeing them too at home. Families are going to now be the progress monitors that the teachers cannot be in person. And that's critically important to start documenting. What do you notice? What do you see? Because there's going to be conversations down the line about how this has affected the students' learning and all of us going forward. So that I want to make the plug at this point, just at least there's a specific website related to special education at OSPI, in addition to the one I already mentioned for general education, or just for general announcements from the superintendent.
And I might just add too, Kashi, if you don't mind.
Please.
This panic that most parents are feeling right now, that, oh, my child's getting behind, and how are they ever going to catch up, is a familiar feeling for families of kids with disabilities. They live with this feeling every day. Now, how will we get caught up to this imaginary norm or standard? I think it's important to remember that there's going to be lost learning for everyone. But for students with disabilities that are already, quote, behind or challenged, these gaps are going to widen. And we can't get away from the notion that it can be heartbreaking to experience or watch your child experience regression of speech and language skills that they just got a handle on before this happened, or potty training, they just figured that out before this happened, and it's all changed. And for families, that can be very devastating to see this. So I think, again, I would really urge families to be in close communication, because it's important that schools assess, are students with disabilities really able to benefit from the same supports and services being offered to their non-disabled peers, and our specially designed supports really being delivered in some way that prevents regression, because for students with disabilities, it can be considerably challenging and impactful. So I want to make sure that the schools are asking some tough questions if there are educators listening. You know, is the guidance being followed, and are schools practicing strong community engagement? Are we really looking at how students are faring through this process who have disabilities that are separate and different from typical kids, I think, generally. And again, I would just encourage families then to stay very connected with other families and nonprofits and ombuds who can help them suss that out and identify their needs.
Thank you. We are already getting a number of questions coming in, so I want to transition to sort of our last prepared topic, and then we'll take some questions. Yeah. I'll say in advance that if we don't get to all the questions, we do our best to follow up on the ones that we don't get to, so please keep sending them. Scott H., if you want to just take a couple of minutes, I know what we've talked about is that we're in sort of the home stretch of the academic year. What advice or encouragement do you have for families about how to stay the course?
Yeah, thanks. I would say the very first thing is we got to root for each other. Within your own homes, you got to root for each other. Your kids need to root for you as parents in this difficult time, and you need to root for your kids. Love them, support them, validate them, help them know that our homes are safe places and that they're loved. I really believe that. And, you know, I, at the hospital, we have this just incredible group of teachers. And every day, we're going and we're working with patients who are in crisis, and we're trying to help them stay in a learner's posture. We know that their progress is not going to be at the same pace as their peers back in their community school programs. Because of the medical treatments necessary, we know that the amount of time they have to devote to school is less. And so our goal is always keep them in a learner's posture. Help them connect to that part of their development as people, as students. And so I think within our homes, we have a great opportunity to adapt that so that as we do personal responsibility tasks, chores within our homes, that can be part of keeping kids connected to that learner part of themselves. We learn new chores, we learn new ways to help, we learn new ways to engage with our own family values. There's lots of projects that can be available. Our team on our website is putting forward projects that you can do that extend learning across multiple subject areas that are high engagement. And we've got sample documentation templates, just like Scott's talking about. There are lots of ways that we as families get to praise effort, not outcomes. So when we think about growth as teachers, we see growth as incremental across the school year and across the school career. So as families, we get to really reinforce that and say, I'm not going to correct everything that I see wrong. I'm going to correct what was the thrust or the focus of that lesson, because we don't want to overwhelm our kids with too much feedback. We want to praise the effort, focus on the main point of the lesson, and keep looking at that incremental progress and growth. And then last thing I would just say, we can keep engagement high as we partner with our schools. Continue to ask questions, seek understanding, seek advice, seek strategies. Your school team is ready. They're going to help. I believe that. And where they don't, reach out to us. You can ask. We have an Ask a Teacher function on our website. You can reach out directly to our teachers, and we'll get back to you. We've got great resources at OSPI. We've got great resources at the ARC and PAVE and all these places where we can be supplements to the advice and guidance you're receiving.
Thank you. If we want to put up the key takeaway slide, we'll switch to taking some questions from panelists. We've gotten a number already, which is great. And so some of these are along similar themes. So I want to ask one that I'm going to sort of combine from a couple of different people. Jennifer and Mandrake have both asked questions about students who are unable to access learning in a virtual environment. There's a special ed component to this, and there's one that's not mentioned if it's special or general education. How do we keep kids from falling behind their peers? And, you know, even with stellar things, feeling like kids are falling behind or not able to learn in this way. Stacy, could I maybe go to you first for this question, and then others are welcome to chime in?
I think, you know, in the special education world, falling behind is regression sometimes. And I think that's a more critical issue than kind of this ableist concept of keeping up. Um, and and I would urge families to try to reframe some of their fear around that issue. Again, I think the priority is um, looking at what allows a child to stay engaged. That, you know, I love Scott's language around being in a learner's posture. There, you know, even in crisis, you know, we learn. It's very legitimate to consider surviving and coping as a valid learning skill. And so I guess my advice would be to stop worrying about the keeping up, watch for those signs of regression that really can be difficult to make up for a child with a disability, and reach out for help when you see that happening. And then just again, try to reframe the priorities that you have so that you see incremental progress and growth as very valid.
Yeah, I'll jump in too and say that online learning is one tool that we have available right now, and as a state, as a system of education, as individual districts and classrooms and localities, online learning is one tool. Now, it is the tool that seems to reach the most people in the quickest way right now. But it's one tool, and so if it's not working for your child, that again is an opportunity to reach back out to your school and say, "This is not an option for my kiddo. Here's why. Here's why online learning is not helping my child engage in continuous learning." And explore other options, because we do continue to have other tools. While we can't be face to face in a classroom right now, there are other tools beyond online learning that include deployment of materials and resources and things that can be done offline.
Thank you. And I think related to that, you know, we've gotten a question about asking for some clarity about what documentation means and how we do that well. So, Jim, would you mind taking that question about what families can be documenting and how they do that to set themselves up for success?
Sure, thank you. So it's such a great question, and there's lots of different, kind of answers I think to it. But I think the bottom line is, is as Scott Raub was talking about, you are the progress monitor, right? So how do you kind of be able to say, all right, well, I'm documenting the progress towards the goals that we have in mind, and they are, as has been mentioned, may be very different than the IEP goals, right? No one's expecting you to run the IEP from home. So creating maybe the goal is just to kind of get them at the table for that socialization opportunity. Maybe the goal is to talk to your teacher and ask about, all right, well, are having a lot of behavior problems at home. What can you do to help me? Those are things that you want to document, and you can document them by an email to your teacher, to your IEP team. I mentioned getting your doctor involved, so it's absolutely appropriate to contact your doctor and say, hey, here's some of the things that we're dealing with. They can, doctor can write a letter of medical necessity for some of the therapies, those extra therapies that Stacy was talking about. And I think it just refers to creating a paper trail of, here's what's going on. Here's the areas that I'm worried about. Here's the things that I'm worried about regression, right? Here are the true obstacles to my child's learning. How do I document them in a way that we're going to be able to return to them at a later date to discuss them?
Right. I'd like to add too, to kind of, I think what Jim's saying is really important. And to add only that, to kind of go off of what was said earlier, to promote communication with your teachers and school districts, that ask them for ideas on how to document too, because that can be part of the two-way conversation as to how do teachers document progress and document what they're seeing? And then what are some of those strategies, or what advice or strategies could they give to me as a family to do that at home? And as Stacy said earlier, you as a family have the opportunity to identify your own priorities, document in a way that makes sense to you as well. If it is a daily log or daily schedule, because I've heard from families where the school building closures, the biggest thing was the disruption to the student's schedule. Now there's a lack of routine, and their sleep patterns are even disrupted. So, I mean, there's a lot of different variability, and it's you're going to have to determine as a family what works best for you and your needs as a family. And I think it's okay to ask the school district what kind of documentation works for you, or some ideas, and then at the same time as a family figure out how can we prioritize this, and what makes sense in our daily routine now too. So all those are really great ideas, and I just wanted to add that the school district can also be a resource in figuring out what does documentation mean and look like, because I'm sure down the line there's going to be a great need to use that documentation to have conversations about when we get back to some kind of form of normal. To be very helpful.
Right, because that all of that record keeping, that keeping track of what's occurring and what it looks like, what the patterns are, all of that allows a more productive conversation. So I think sometimes we hear paper trail or we hear documentation and we're kind of thinking in an adversarial way. And while we know that that's true, we know that there are situations where we as families feel on the opposite side of the table from schools. A more productive conversation can be had when we have evidence of what we've been seeing and observing, so that we can put that out and objectively look at it together as a team to address needs going forward.
I think that is like the perfect segue, because we've gotten a number of questions about, what to do when this isn't going well. I mean, right now we've been talking about it in the context of setting yourself up for success, but a number of people have submitted questions saying that this isn't going well, or, what should I be doing if my district isn't providing services and isn't communicating? So what are your thoughts on ways to advocate? I was looking at sort of Scott R. and Stacy for this. I don't know who wants to go first.
I guess I'll start off. There's always the try again approach, because right, the school districts and teachers, like I've heard from families that, even within the same household, one teacher is very responsive and the next is not. Teachers themselves are struggling with this, and teachers themselves sometimes may not feel like they're getting the support they need from their district or their administrators. So there's going to need to be a little bit of patience, even though that's already been exhausted for many of us. The trying again is definitely part of it, because that creates documentation of some sort. If you're trying via email or if you're making a phone call, there's usually a record of that as well. There is the possibility of going to the district office or the district website to see if there's a resource or a place to submit a question, and to say to the district, I haven't been contacted yet, or the contact that I am receiving isn't working for me right now, because they're calling at odd hours or hours that doesn't work for our family's needs. So this again goes back to what we've already talked about, what's our priority or needs as a family, and being able to communicate that back. And our office is still open. The building is not physically open, but my role, families can contact me, and I'll be a guide to try to navigate what are some of the more formal procedural safeguards that families have. All of those systems are still intact, and so the OSPI website is always the way to reach out to OSPI, and you could even ask for me specifically, and I could even get you contact information for a district administrator if it's not working well with a teacher as it's going. But right, patience is always the hardest thing to keep going back to when it's in short supply. But that's how I'd start off in saying that you try to keep at it, but also try to document what's not working for you.
Thank you.
And I would just add, sorry.
Go ahead.
I would just add, kind of the unspoken question there is, when all that doesn't work, then what? And, you know, the elephant in the room right now is there's just no enforcement right now. It's the Wild West. This is all new. So I think that, you know, as a family, this is what ombuds are for. Call the governor's office of the education ombuds. See if you can get help there. Call Scott, see if you can get help there. Call your district office, try to get a hold of your special education director. You know, as Scott said, try to be empathetic and sympathetic to the notion that your child's teacher may have her own children at home and maybe going through her own, maybe your child's teacher is sick with COVID. You know, you don't know what's happening there. So I wouldn't jump to significant conclusions right away until you have more information. I know that the bottom line is that you need support. And so if you're going to be vigilant and tenacious about something, it would be to do that. But there is not a hotline to help you right now. And so we've got to all just kind of work together on this.
Hopefully in the comments, some of these resources have been mentioned, so they're available to families, but those websites are great. And thank you for volunteering yourselves and your organizations as places that people can go for information. For those of us who can only stay until 3:30, I want to just give you a little bit of information to wrap up. And then I think we'll try to take one or two more questions because our panelists have some flexibility, so we can stay a little bit after 3:30, but we promise to only take until 3:30 of your time. So thank you all for joining us today. The next panel in our series is on Friday, May 15th at 2:30. If we didn't get to your question, we do our best to respond after the panel ends. All of resources information that we mentioned, as well as a recording of this panel, are made available on seattlechildrens.org/coping-and-COVID. And then before we lose people at 3:30, I just want to say again, a huge thank you to all of the panelists, especially our guest panelists, Stacy and Scott, for being with us, to our marketing and communication colleagues for making it happen, and to the audiovisual team for all of their time and expertise in basically technology magic. Let's take a couple more questions. One of the ones that keeps coming up is a question about what OSPI might be doing in the future to support as we transition back. So how is OSPI going to oversee recommended continuity of learning plans? And is there an intent to put together a group of diverse stakeholders to talk about future plans for services? What do we know and not know? Maybe is a way to ask that question.
I don't know. But I would say if the past is any prologue, yes. I mean, and even in the decision making that's been happening right now, there's been an attempt to get as many stakeholders to have input as possible. And that starts, you know, with the superintendent down to the assistant superintendent for special ed. Even in my role, I know that I try to get as many people involved to give feedback and input. And so right now, I don't know. I think there's a great deal of uncertainty, and that's a very unsatisfying answer. But I understand that at this point, you know, we will have to wait and see.
And whether or not it's an unsatisfying answer, it's a reality of the times, right? There's so much uncertainty. There's a lot that's being taken into consideration. And so I myself really appreciate knowing the reliable sources to go to, knowing that the OSPI websites exist, knowing that the ARC exists, and that those are places we can go to for great information is really helpful. We have a question that I would maybe think a couple of you could answer that might be interesting about from Sherilyn about if we have resources that help develop measurable outcomes of coping skills or other learnings our kids with special needs are taking on through all of this. Jim, I kind of want to put you on the spot and say, do you have any thoughts on resources?
You know, I mean, I think that it's such a great question. It's like, how do we measure, you know, all of this? And I'm going to, you know, say the same thing Scott did. I don't know, you know, what's out there. I think that, you know, speaking to your teachers and speaking to your, you know, and I think, you know, a big thing that I think we're all going to be anticipating is what is the mental health burden following all this, right? And I think that, you know, if I can pivot a little bit, is just think about, you know, let's really pay attention to your child's, you know, mental health, right? And I think that, you know, there are going to be consequences. You know, there could be, you know, we're anticipating a flood of challenges, and you know, pay attention. And if there are ways to measure the impact of all of this. Smart people are going to figure them out, and they're going to be out there. So, keep in contact. I think that relates to the last question as well, is we're all feeling very isolated, and I think that we're all feeling like really drained of sitting on a screen and going on the internet and trying to seek more information. But if you are able to kind of prioritize, all right, well, this is the information I think is going to be the most helpful for me. And we've talked about so many great resources, and we have so many great folks in our community. Another one that I would just throw out there is the Washington Autism Advocacy Alliance. They're doing a lot of really good work around just keeping families informed. The Informing Families website is another really good one, just to kind of let folks know. So ask questions, keep communicating, reach out to those people, whether it's your doctors or your teachers or anybody, and ask them those questions. Don't feel like you have to figure it out all yourself. Just keep in contact, keep interacting with people.
Yeah, I'm feeling like the giving yourself grace and putting your family first and remembering what your family needs was a huge takeaway of basically all of these conversations we've been having on Facebook Live, is that being really good to yourself and to your family, knowing that everyone is doing the best they can right now, including the other people who may or may not be making it look easy on their social media, and the teachers who are working hard. I want to open it up for another comment or two, and then I think we will wrap up. Scott, it looked like you wanted to add something there.
Yeah, I guess I was just going to say, one, echo Jim and say the mental health and well-being of your family is the first priority. And we see schools acknowledge that too, in that one of the first things our school system did was look for continuity in our meals program, making sure that the nutritional needs of families that rely on schools were met. So I just want to echo Jim and say that that mental health piece for your family is really, really important. In terms of formal measures for social emotional learning, I guess the thing that I think about is that many of our students have social emotional goals in their individualized education plans. And so as you think about it sounds like the question is thinking about resiliency and coping through complex emotions, through big emotions. As you think about, what goal would you set for your child? What are you seeing come up for them that you really want to support them through? That's how you start to formulate your goal. And then the measurement of it is really thinking about what are the outcomes that you're hoping for. So perhaps an outcome is that your child can name the emotion that they feel in that moment. And so you set the goal of, I want to name the emotion, and you then, as the emotion coach in your family, say, oh, right now I'm feeling this. So you model it, and you say, it looks like you might be feeling that, and you name that emotion for your child. And so I think, as I think about resiliency and coping, I really think about what are the needs that I'm seeing from my child, and how do I want to help support them through that. And then I guess I would say, in the On the Pulse blog, there's a post about coping right now and resiliency.
Thank you. I think we are going to wrap up. I think that's the time we have today. I want to just reiterate a couple of things that, there were at least 4 websites mentioned in this, and those are all going to be good places that people can go. So Seattle Children's has a school services page as well as an autism blog. The OSPI has a web page as well as the Arc of Washington, and those are all, any of those 4 are going to be great starting places to get to some of the other resources that our panelists mentioned today. I want to give again a huge thank you to the panel and to our team and to all of you for being here watching with us. Tune into our next one in a couple of weeks, and resources are available on seattlechildrens.org/coping in COVID. Stay healthy and well.